Today, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Dr. Eberts, Dr. Derrek Eberts. He's from the Geography and Environment here, just around the corner here on the fourth floor. He describes himself as an economic and labor geographer who teaches and does research in the areas of economic and urban geography, tourism, quality of life, and the Canadian craft brewing industry. It's all yours.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to share some of my research I've been doing over the past couple of years, more recent work I've done. One is kind of a continuation of work I've been doing for 15 years, but a variation of it. Another is a kind of a new project, but both of them are related to the impacts of COVID-19 on tourism and recreation. So I've just called it vaguely some impacts of COVID-19 on tourism and recreation. So what I'm really going to do in this talk is summarize two separate, but like I said, sort of related studies that I conducted sort of during and after a sabbatical leave, January to June, and then following that through 2022. The first thing I'll talk about is a study of the impacts of COVID-19 on tourism in Jalisco State, Mexico. And the second will be more of the recreation leisure end, so a study of the impacts of COVID-19 on golf courses in southern Manitoba. So it'll be kind of two separate pieces. I'll go through them both, and we can have maybe questions at the end rather than a pause halfway and then carry on and a pause at the end for questions. I'll just do them both, hopefully get through it all, and questions on both studies at the end. So the first thing I'll talk about is the work I've done on tourism, the impacts of COVID-19 on small communities in rural kind of Jalisco State near the mega resort of Puerto Vallarta. I'm not looking at the impacts on Puerto Vallarta itself, rather these small towns around Puerto Vallarta who have benefited from tourism or have hoped to benefit from tourism related to being near this mega resort with millions of visitors every year. I've got two authors listed here because I did this work in conjunction with a colleague in Puerto Vallarta I've been working with for many years, who's located at the University of Guadalajara's Puerto Vallarta campus called Centro Universitario de la Costa. And so he and I have worked with various students over the years on a variety of projects around tourism in these communities. This is just one more, a continuing version of that research specifically addressing COVID-19. So a little bit of context for this part of the study. Of course, tourism is important to the country of Mexico. Mexico is the 15th largest economy in the world as of last year's GDP data. It does have a fairly high rate of poverty, which is relevant because tourism is often sort of billed as a economic development strategy to address poverty, particularly sometimes rural poverty. Mexico has the second highest level of income inequality amongst the OECD countries. That is, the disparity between rich and poor is very great in Mexico. And so in that context, tourism has been an important part of the economy of the country. In 2019, so prior to COVID, Mexico had the 16th largest tourist economy in the world by tourism receipts. It was the 7th largest by the number of arrivals. So it is a big tourism economy across the entire country. Number of international visitors to Mexico exceeded 45 million in that year. Value to the economy was over, in American dollars, 24.5 billion. Got the pesos there, or about 8.5% of GDP. So a significant share of the national economy is related to tourism. And of those tourists, over half come from the US and about 15% come from Canada and then various other parts of the world. Nearly 4 million people work in tourism jobs, about 6% of national employment. So it's a significant sector for the country. So to give you a sense of what COVID-19 did to that, just in terms of the economic data, well, the first thing is, of course, we had this massive drop in visitation. There is a delay, you're right. Right after the travel restrictions were put in place for the origin countries like Canada and the US. So one of the peculiar things about Mexico is they really never did restrict visitation. They didn't close the borders in any way whatsoever. But we all restricted people leaving our countries. So tourism in Mexico dropped fairly precipitously. And you can see after that really big bump in 2019, 2020 itself, and 21 starts to recover. And then by 2022, we're kind of back to a trajectory of growth, but we're certainly not where we would have been had tourism just continued growing. And by the way, the red line is international visitors, and the green line is international tourists. The difference being tourists stay for more than a day. Visitors might be all those people who come for a day and leave the same day. Maybe more importantly, though, spending, of course, this is the impact on the economy, actually did that same thing in terms of that massive drop right around 2020 through the 2020 season. But it really recovered very quickly, which is kind of remarkable. You saw that the tourist numbers didn't go back up to where they had been before, but the spending in American dollars equivalent kind of took this track as if really it had never really stopped, right? So that's kind of really encouraging in my opinion. This is just all the quantitative data. I haven't got to my surveys of the small towns yet, just giving some of the context. Similarly with employment. Naturally, as tourism declines, you would expect people in tourism would be losing their jobs, and they did. So there was this drop in employment in 2020, 21, recovered. And again, it's kind of back where it probably would roughly have been if this trajectory had continued on the rate it was heading before the pandemic. So that's kind of encouraging in a sense. So that's the national picture for Mexico. What about Puerto Vallarta and the region around Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco State? Well, Puerto Vallarta is a relatively recent tourism destination, globally speaking. The first tourist hotel opened in 1948. By the 1960s, we had cruise ships coming. The airport grew, and we started having this growth of the population. So before the big tourism boom in Puerto Vallarta, it was a small fishing village, literally 13,000 in 1964. By 2009, just the latest data I had on the actual population of Puerto Vallarta itself, the population was over 350,000. And a significant proportion of that population is, of course, related directly or indirectly to tourism. They say that tourism constitutes around 80%. Whoops, I didn't mean to go forward. I meant to hit the highlighter. 80% of economic activity in Puerto Vallarta. So that's the city of Puerto Vallarta, the resort. As I said, I'm interested in the towns around it, the ones that are kind of trying to benefit from being close to this mega resort with all this visitation, all these rich, relatively speaking to them, rich Americans, Canadians, and others, bringing money into the economy. So before COVID, Puerto Vallarta would see around 4 million visitors annually, and about half of the employment in the city and the region was in tourism or related to tourism. As I said, 80% of economic activity. We don't have as good a quality data on tracking what the COVID pandemic did to visitation in Puerto Vallarta. The Mexican data I shared with you was from the government's official statistical source. But Puerto Vallarta and Jalisco State don't have the same kind of quality of data. So I figured the best thing to do would be to show you international arrivals at the airport. It's the only one I could really find which was kind of reliable official data. But you see the same general picture. So I think this is going to sort of tell us what we hoped to see anyways, that yes, tourism in Puerto Vallarta was on this kind of relatively steady growth trajectory, dropped of course with COVID-19, picked back up. And now tourist arrivals at the airport in Puerto Vallarta by the end of 2022 were where they would have been without the interruption. So yes, the pandemic was a massive disruption, but it was really temporary, and the economy, the population, the spending and so on really did seem to recover pretty quickly, which is a kind of a good news story in terms of the resilience question around a tourism-based economy. So just to give it some more context, what do we know about tourism in this region and people's perceptions of it? We've been studying this for the better part of 15 years now, and we're finding over and over that most people, and I am talking about the small towns, are very optimistic about tourism's potential for improving quality of life in their community. Now, I say that in the context of the way they see tourism is around economy and jobs. So we talk about tourism's impacts across a number of dimensions: economic impacts, social and cultural impacts, environmental impacts. So we talk about all these dimensions of the impacts of tourism, but when we ask people these kinds of questions, they almost always think about the economic impacts because they think it will be good for their town or their household economy, frankly, for job creation and for quality of life. So that's the tendency for people to be optimistic about tourism. And we see questions, we see results like this. I'm sorry Pete's here because I know he hates pie charts, but I think they have a good place when there's only a few categories and you're talking about shares of a whole. So with that defense of my graphics, so by and large, people think that their communities offer them a good quality of life. So you see quality of life in my community is, I'm really summarizing a very, very small sliver of what we find from these other studies, but it is about, for me, quality of life. Quality of life is good or excellent. So the green or purple make up, sort of more than 3/4 of people's responses. So mostly people are pretty, happy with life in their communities. At the same time, they're optimistic that after tourism develops, or with more tourism development, whichever we ask the question, life will be better or much better. Again, sort of 3/4 of the responses are optimistic about how good, how positive tourism will be for their communities. So over and over, people are optimistic, but when we get into questions about the other kinds of impacts, people have less of a sense of a perception of what the impacts of tourism will be for their lives and their communities. They're a lot more uncertain about the environmental and the socio-cultural impacts. And in particular, they have a very hard time imagining negative impacts. So we try to prompt them, say, well, what about the drawbacks? What about the negatives? Well, they didn't really think about that. You have to really push them hard to even think about tourism having negative impacts. Well, more visitation is going to create inflation, perhaps, congestion, more pollution, more garbage, all these sorts of things might be negative impacts of tourism, but they don't seem to even want to think about that. They're very optimistic about tourism, which again is why the COVID-19 pandemic was such a big jolt to their expectations, the trajectories of these towns' development. Now, I do have this slide I often share. It's called Reality Check because this is not a study I did, but many, many years ago, my colleague Rodrigo and other people had done some previous studies of a place called Punta de Mita, which is near Puerto Vallarta, where there was a major tourism development, a Four Seasons hotel resort kind of thing, really geared towards the ultra-rich. And after it was built, there was lots of optimism about this wonderful new tourism development, bringing all this prosperity to the community. And after it was built, people were asked, well, who did benefit from this big development? And once they realized what was going on and how it was actually affecting them, mostly it was the government and investors who benefited, and to a much lesser degree, the town people, everyone. I mean, they're kind of vague categories, but you get the idea that the reality tends to be that the optimism outweighs the reality, but that doesn't mean it isn't important. I think it's still important to understand what people think and feel about the places they live and what's going on in them. So this research is getting at sort of questions about how has COVID-19 disrupted the trajectory of tourism and its benefits to these communities. How have they coped? I'm going to say a little less about that here, but maybe I can address some of it in the questions. And does it raise questions about the sustainability of a tourism-led development model? Does this vulnerability to these kind of exogenous shocks raise these kinds of questions? Okay, so we studied this question. In this context, we picked two towns. They're both what are called Pueblos Mágicos, magical towns, San Sebastián del Oeste and Sayulita, both within what I would call sort of day trip range of Puerto Vallarta. San Sebastián is an interior, old sort of Spanish colonial silver mining town. It's got a lot of heritage value, and there's a lot of, I guess, sort of natural amenity around it as well. Sayulita is kind of a coastal, for a long time, sort of a bohemian kind of, people would come there to surf and live on the beach and camp and things like this. Really not the resort kind of tourism, but really more of a artsy kind of community, that sort of thing. And just give you a sense of where they are. Where is this going? It's trying. There we go. So Mexico, Puerto Vallarta is kind of halfway up the coast, up the Pacific coast in the Banderas Bay, Bay of Flags. And so here's Puerto Vallarta, the major city. And the towns I'm talking about are San Sebastián del Oeste here in the interior, in the highlands, and Sayulita on the coast around this peninsula. So like I said, sort of day trip range, and the kind of places it's easy to take a bus and go to for the day and come back if you're, in Puerto Vallarta. Okay, so what do? We did resident perception surveys in the summer of 2022. We got responses from 70 people in San Sebastián del Oeste and 68 people in Sayulita, and I'll just sort of share some of the results from those. We plan to supplement this research with interviews with tourism officials in these communities to get the kind of the official perspective versus what do residents think about what happened, but we haven't done that stage yet, so that will be still to come, maybe this coming February. So sort of first stage, we asked residents to think about what was life like before COVID-19, so up to 2019. And by and large, people still at the time were very optimistic about the importance of tourism to their communities. So on a scale of 1 to 10, no pie charts, how important is tourism to your community? And most people rated in that 8, 9, 10 range. You can see clearly there's a very strong optimism around how important tourism is for their communities. So not surprisingly, how important is it to develop more tourism? Because of course, if it's good, more will be better. And again, the same kind of results, the majority of respondents quite optimistic about the importance of developing more tourism for the benefit of the community. Would you say your town was prospering economically before the pandemic? So somewhat and very much would be kind of neutral to agreeing kind of scale of the questions. And most people saying, yep, we are prospering, our community is doing well, both San Sebastian del Oeste and Sayulita, in the kind of 80% plus range of satisfaction that their town is prospering, or at least, somewhat prospering or prospering very much economically before COVID-19. Before COVID-19, would you say that life is good in your town? These are very generic kind of questions that are used. The phrasing is used commonly in resident perception and quality of life studies. So is life good? Is it kind of a way of allowing them to express their perception more freely? And yeah, so by and large, again, this time we've got green and purple being the agree and strongly agree, and the majority of respondents agreeing or strongly agreeing that yes, they believe life is good in their communities. In fact, in San Sebastian del Oeste, nobody said they strongly disagreed with that. That's the 0. And in Sayulita, again, only 10% sort of on the negative side of this question, and everywhere else more on the positive side of this question. So what happened during COVID-19? Did the impact of COVID-19 on tourism have a negative effect on your town? We're kind of really linking tourism directly to the impact on their town. And most people said, yeah, somewhat serious to very serious impacts on their town. And again, we left it kind of open as to what we meant by negative impact. So let people express their sense of that, however they kind of feel. But again, based on what we know about their feelings about tourism, I'm going to suspect that most of this is their perceptions of the economic impacts. And in both communities, very comparable results. Were the impacts of COVID-19 in your town mainly due to tourism? So in other words, there could be all kinds of reasons why their town was impacted by COVID, but were the impacts mainly due to COVID? And the majority, mainly due to tourism, and the majority of people said, yeah, they felt that tourism was the main driver of the negative impacts of COVID on their communities. Did you or anyone in your family experience a job loss? Not really overwhelmingly yes or no, pretty mixed, but certainly a significant number. And maybe more importantly, is that my next slide or not? I'll get to that in a second. If you did lose a job, did the person who lost it, or did somebody you know in your household lose a job, was it related to tourism? For those who did lose jobs, tourism was overwhelmingly the sector that was affected. And also kind of related, actually, sorry, getting ahead of myself, should watch my notes. If I'm not going to, I'll just put them down. How long did the period of unemployment last? In both cases, it wasn't all that long, less than a year average, but there were some at the extreme end. So up to a couple of years, up to 3 years. Also some at the shorter end, as short as, a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So quite a range, but in both cases, we're averaging sort of 8 to 9 months or so as the period of unemployment. And this is significant, I should say, before I go on, because Mexico doesn't have the kind of income support systems and the kind of programs that we had in Canada and other places to support people through the economic impact of COVID. So these people were just sort of left to find ways to cope. And that's the part of the objectives that I'm not really quite addressing here with slides. But, of course, a lot of just, relying on family and friends and those kinds of informal networks. There weren't a lot of formal programs to support people. But here's the other kind of dimension of the impact on households. Did your family experience a reduction in total household income? And this one is a little more clear. Whether or not there were job losses in the household, there were a lot more reports of, yes, we did have a reduction in our household income. So in other words, we may not have lost a job, but we still saw the household income decline enough that it kind of made a difference. So that's, again, part of that overall impact without the kind of government compensation support to make up for it. So overall, was your town negatively impacted by COVID-19? And yeah, the minimal rating, which is now the green, the minimal rating is a smaller sliver of people's responses. Most people said somewhat or very serious impacts on the community were negative due to COVID-19. Okay, so nevertheless, during COVID-19, was life good? And I would still say we have, it's a reduction in positivity, but it's still a fairly optimistic or a fairly positive outlook on how life is. So we still have the agree and strongly agree, green and purple, making up a majority of responses in both cases. So despite the fact that COVID was hard on the towns, people still felt like, life is still, overall, life's pretty good. Maybe not quite as strongly as before, but generally speaking, that's the attitude we see. Now, what happens after COVID, after we see the so-called recovery? Because as we saw by 2022, tourism had rebounded, the borders were open, and I have to say having been there, it was as busy as it's ever been. And certainly the tourism had fully pretty much recovered through the 2022 season. Okay, so how's that impacted your community? Now that tourism is recovering, are things going back to the way they were? Mostly very strong. Yes, things are back to normal. So again, a very short-term impact of this massive global pandemic, this massive exogenous shock on their local economies. So that's a pretty positive sign. People are feeling like, yeah, we're back to normal very quickly. Do you think your town will prosper after COVID-19? And again, we're into, again, the positive somewhat very much is 3/4 of the responses or more. Almost more than 80% here for Sayulita. So somewhat very much, yes, very positive outlooks around the possibility of economic prosperity returning. Looking ahead, when COVID is no longer a problem, will life be good? And we're back to those overwhelmingly positive sort of, 95% nearly, well, 93%, and again, sort of 90% here almost in the agree and strongly agree. So people are, again, very, very optimistic about life being good in their communities. So that's a nutshell of what we found in these studies. So I want to just do a quick comparison of the two key questions. How would you rate the economic prosperity of your community? If we go to, I'll kind of flip back and forth. This is the before COVID-19, and this is the after COVID-19. And so you can see really, really comparable results. There wasn't much of a drop in how people feel about the prosperity of the communities comparing before and after COVID. Of course, the in-between, we didn't ask about prosperity during COVID, but we asked if life is good. So that's the other question to compare. How was the response to the life is good question before, during, and after COVID? How do those compare? Again, I'll just flip through quickly. So again, we had this sort of 3/4 or more, 90% I should say, or more saying yes, life is good, agree or strongly agree. It drops during COVID and it goes back up after COVID. So you can see that it's pretty clear people's perceptions of the impact of COVID-19 in terms of a massive disruption to the trajectory of development has been really temporary, which is a good sign as far as, I would say, as far as at least a perception amongst the members of the communities of resilience. Okay, so what are some conclusions? Well, as we expected, based on both quantitative visitation data and resident experience, the pandemic's impact was immediate, was negative, and by extension, so prosperity and well-being were negatively affected. However, based on the early post-pandemic data and resident experience and perceptions, it appears the pandemic's impacts were very short-term, and the region has proved, as I said, fairly resilient to this really significant exogenous shock. So that's the first study on tourism. I'm doing okay for time, I think I am. My second study had to do with recreation. They're often grouped as one kind of family of activities, tourism, recreation. So recreation, I looked at COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on golf courses in southern Manitoba. This was done in conjunction with Chris and Doug Ramsey in Rural Development. We got some SSHRC funding for this. I'll acknowledge that right up front, but I've got a slide that says it. So we had a look at how did COVID-19 impact that particular recreational activity in this particular region. So again, I'll give you some of the context of the study here and share the essentials of the results from this study. So some of the context is that of all the things that were affected by COVID-19, recreation, especially outdoor recreation, was really kind of pointed to as one of those areas where this should be okay. You know, as much as restaurants were just decimated and all those kinds of other social activities and gyms, but outdoor recreation should do okay because we can still do that with social distancing without the risks of contact and proximity, all those things. So golf was very early identified as one of those sectors which actually has the prospect and turned out it seemed to be anecdotally doing really well. So you had lots of headlines like this. Golf saw record play. Numbers of official golf surgeon popularity was even better than predicted. Some of the data bears that out. National Golf Foundation in the US, which does collect this kind of data. In 2021, the number of golfers globally reached over 66 million, a new record, up about 10% over the previous 5 years. They noted a meaningful increase in the participation of women and minorities and continued growth amongst youth, which was actually a good thing because there had been a period of maybe kind of slow decline of uptake in golf. It was kind of one of those sports that wasn't continuing to grow the way other sectors had been. So there's some worry that golf is maybe going to become one of those things for the elite and not a mass popular sport. So that was good for the sport in that way as well. So here's some of that data from US performance. And you can see, as I said, a kind of a period of steady, relatively steady decline. And then 2019, 2020, the pandemic, and golf participation, just explodes in a sense relative to the trend. So that was quite the contrast to most of the things we think about when we talk about what we think happened, what impact COVID-19 had on all kinds of economic activity. Most of it was negative, but there's these little pockets of contrast. This is a little slightly different variation of the same information. This is comparing 2020 to 2019 by month. So January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, and so on. So what's happening here, of course, is immediately after the declaration of the pandemic, a lot of stuff just kind of really shut down, including golf. So very quickly, kind of talked about what we can do. Okay, well, we can't go to the gym anymore. We can't travel. We can't go on the vacation we planned. But we can go golfing because the restrictions didn't really affect golf in that immediate way. So almost within about a month of the pandemic being declared and people kind of withdrawing, they kind of came back out and golf just took off. So it's an incredibly short-lived, downturn in golf. And so these numbers show us that we had positive growth as compared to 2019. And that continued to 21 and 22. So what did we do? We looked at 108, well, we contacted 108 golf courses in southern Manitoba. We invited them to participate in our study. We got positive response from 20, so we have a participation rate of nearly 20%. And so in the summer and fall of 2022, we did a telephone interview, which had a combination of closed and open-ended questions about how COVID-19 had impacted their golf courses. We structured the interviews around 3 time periods. So what was the impact immediately after the declaration of the pandemic? What was the impact on the 2020 season as a whole and the 2021 season overall? So we did this in 2022, so we didn't have really full 2020-22 data, but we had the complete seasons of 2020 and 2021 to ask them about. So that was kind of where we went with this study. We asked about impacts on revenue and costs, what their strategies were to deal with some of the things. There were some restrictions, some requirements, even though they were operating and people were golfing, but there were some things they had to do. And what's their future outlook now they've come through this? So we had 10 9-hole courses and 9 18-hole courses in our study and 1 27-hole course. 17 of the courses were public, 3 were semi-private. There was a mix of private ownership, public ownership, and one that called itself kind of a public-private ownership. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but mostly public golf courses, so mostly accessible to all of us who now have time on our hands and can't go traveling to the places we want to go. So in the first few weeks of the pandemic, what happened? So we've got some golf courses which said, yes, we had a decline in the number of golfers or rounds that we served during that time. So of those, so the way I'll present this data, the bars are the number of courses that gave this response. So 6 courses said we had a decrease in the number of golfers, 2 were the same, and 8 said they had an increase. And the numbers where I've put them here is going to be the average percent of decrease or the average percent of increase for those who reported a decrease or an increase, if that makes sense. Okay, so of the 6 courses who said we had a decrease in the number of rounds played, the average decrease was 20%. For the 8 courses who had an increase in rounds or golfers, the average was an increase of 19% for those 8 courses. So a bit of a mixed bag in the immediate weeks following the declaration of the pandemic. And that's not really a big surprise because I think for an initial period of time, people weren't really sure what can we do and figuring out what are we going to do instead of the things we normally do. So there was a bit of not really just jumping straight into a new routine. What did that do for staffing? Well, some courses said, well, of course, we didn't need as many people working, so we didn't hire as many people. Most courses actually didn't change the level of staffing because they weren't sure what the total impacts were going to be. It was a fairly short-term response initially. And in a couple of cases, they said, well, we had to hire more. And part of that was because once you did get rolling, you had to do things like add sanitation and add cleaning of carts and all those sorts of things that required more people. In terms of costs, 17 of the courses reported an increase in costs associated with dealing with opening and running during the pandemic, averaging about a 12% increase in costs. So that's a little bit of the first glimmers of what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, the first few weeks. What happened sort of through the 2020 season? So this time I got to ask about both rounds and memberships. I felt that memberships might also be useful to kind of gauge what was happening to golf as a sport in the province. So we had a much smaller number of courses reporting decreases in golfers or rounds and or memberships. Kind of, a handful saying things stayed the same, but the majority of courses were reporting that they increased both the rounds and the memberships. Some of the decreases, some of the courses that reported decreases were kind of unique situations. And one stands out as an example, because I'll get to this in another slide, but there's one course which reported that almost all of their business is tournaments, which was affected in a much different way than just golf in general. Tournaments almost always involve, a meal, a banquet of some sort, a gathering, usually indoors. So although golf was allowed to go on, those banquets couldn't happen. So a lot of tournaments and events were actually effectively shut down by the restrictions, even though the golf courses themselves were still open. So some courses, despite the trends, despite the opportunity, some courses did see some of these kinds of declines because they were affected by things like the reduction in events. Okay, changes in revenue and cost. Again, some courses still continue to report that their revenues and costs both decreased. Some reported both the revenues and costs increased. The nice part of this story is that those whose revenue decreased, the average decrease in cost, well, that's not a positive sign, was less than the decrease in revenue. So that's not a good sign. But the ones on this side, the increases, while costs did increase, on average, they increased a lot less than the average increase in revenue. So if you saw an increase, chances are your revenue increased a lot more than your costs did, even if they both increased. I'm not trying to suggest, by the way, that all the courses who reported a decrease in revenue reported also a decrease in cost and so on. Some of these are interchanged. It's just on aggregate. These are the numbers of courses that reported a decrease or that reported an increase or no change, obviously, in the middle. Okay, switching to 2021 now. Number of golfers and rounds and memberships. Number of golfers and rounds and memberships. Kind of a similar pattern continues, right? A small number of courses saw these decreases in rounds and memberships. A handful stayed the same. And again, continued growth through the 2021 season for most courses. Most courses saw increases again in number of golfers, number of rounds, and in number of memberships. So the sport is continuing to gain popularity through the 2021 season. Again, change in staffing. We had some courses saying, well, we didn't need as many people, decrease. Some people said, well, some courses saying, well, we had around the same number of people. And some, again, reporting that they needed more staff than they did before. And by the way, something else I probably should have put in a bit of context is that these numbers don't just reflect the staff required to support golf itself. Sometimes this reflects, which courses actually have, say, a restaurant on the side. Not all courses do. Which courses have a gift shop. Not all courses do. So some of that is not really captured by this data, but that was another one of the impacts, is that while golf rounds may have gone up, maybe other areas of the operation declined. Or maybe as you shifted from meals in the restaurant to takeout, you required less kitchen and serving staff, but more people doing that sanitation work we talked about, sanitizing carts and sanitizing surfaces and all that sort of stuff. Change in revenue cost, again, this time actually a much clearer picture. Of only one course reported a decrease in cost, and nobody reported a decrease in revenue, so that's good. A couple saying, well, 4 or 5, 6 saying the same. And again, most courses reporting that both revenue and costs increased, but by and large, revenue increased by more than the increase in costs. Yeah. I should have put that in, good question. I should have put that in context. This question was asked both for 2021 and for 2020. The question was asked in comparison to a normal year. Okay, so if you look at how golf was before the pandemic, what would be normal for your course? Was this an increase or a decrease in cost, an increase or decrease in revenue, and so on? Excellent point. I should have pointed that out. Thanks. Okay, so I have some verbal responses to some of the questions that maybe shed additional light on the experiences the courses had. So again, following the 2021 season, you got to kind of reflect a little bit on how things had gone over the past couple of years. And on the question of revenue, not only did it increase, this is just one example. I've given them all numbers, so 15 just means course number 15 in my study. It doesn't mean anything, it's just a code. Not only did it increase, but it was the largest revenue here in the history of the golf course, the best year in the history of golf. This was a clear expression of it, but the same sentiment was expressed by a lot of courses, that this was the boom time that they'd never imagined they would have in golf. Sorry, I was going to do a thing on tournaments and then come back to some more comments. So this is the one that kind of did sort of hurt. because tournaments and events, and I have other events because some golf courses have facilities where you do things like wedding receptions and parties, this sort of thing. So tournaments and events. Most courses over the 2 years that we're talking about talked about a much lower number of tournaments and events as compared to what they would have held in a normal season. So this is the average for all the courses we asked. This isn't the number of courses that said this. This is, so on average of the courses we talked to, they would have 18 tournaments a year, 7 point something, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number here, but 7 point something average number of events in a given year. And in 2020, that was reduced to, you can see at most a couple for this. And then by 2021, a little bit of recovery, but certainly nowhere near what the number of events and tournaments would have been in a normal year. So that did hurt, but to counter that, a lot of courses actually said, you know what, we make more money on green fees, so maybe we won't have tournaments anymore because we're actually making more money not having tournaments. Anyway, so speaking of long-term impacts, maybe you'll find it harder to organize a tournament for your organization next year. So what are some of the challenges that they faced during this period? A lot of courses expressed in a variety of ways frustration with the rules because the rules were changing frequently. And they weren't given a lot of guidance from the government as to how to implement these rules. They were just told, well, starting next week or starting tomorrow, here's the new rule you have to abide by. And how you do it, well, that's up to you to figure out. So a lot of the courses, and bearing in mind, a lot of these are small town courses, staffed by volunteers often, they don't have the capacity to deal with this kind of stuff immediately. So there's a lot of frustration with that. So it was consistently inconsistent. They were changing daily, weekly, and it was from a volunteer board standpoint. We had a lot of work for our executive members. The rules changed once a week. Nobody could decide what was going on. What could I say? Getting more than 1 day notice on changes and restrictions, that's one of the biggest things we've been dealing with, and it seemed pretty ad hoc and very short notice. But of course, they've never gone through anything like this before. Pretty understandable. And I didn't highlight the pretty understandable, but this is one thing that I kind of picked up on in a lot of the interview transcripts was that despite being frustrated, despite being unhappy with how difficult it was to cope with it, a lot of them somewhere in the answer said, well, it was understandable. You can't blame them. They were doing their best. So despite how difficult it was for the golf courses and their staff, their management, they kind of mostly, not all, appreciated the fact that this was new territory. And so the government maybe didn't necessarily know what they were doing either. Don't want to say your government doesn't know what they're doing, but they didn't know what they were doing. So that's frustration with the rules. This was a particular one that came up in a number of the interviews, this idea of cart dividers. Somewhere along the way, the government decided that if we're going to have people sitting beside each other, that's pretty close. So we're going to have to put something in the carts to divide people from each other. And so they came up with this idea of cart dividers. I don't have a picture of one, but basically it's a little plexiglass thing. I don't know if anyone golfed during this time period, but they had these little plexiglass things that went between the two people. Even if you're from the same household, the rule was you had to have cart dividers. You could sit at the same table in the restaurant from the same household, but you had to have a cart divider. So we had to purchase these cart dividers in order for two people to ride in the same cart. It was an absolute cash grab, if you ask me, although I don't think the government made any money off of them. These things were not cheap. We have 104 carts. I think these things were in the neighborhood of $60 each, so that's over $6,000, just so we could have 2 cart riders for 3 or 4 weeks, because then it was actually, the restriction was removed. And so now they've got all these cart dividers. Where are they now? Sitting in a shed collecting dust. We'll probably never use them again, and we'll never pay that off. So that was a really big frustration for those courses that have carts, for those who actually followed the rules and have carts. What else? Client attitudes, of course, you can probably imagine, right? We saw this all over Manitoba, all over the country, all over the world. People expressing frustration with businesses, with the kids at the doors of the businesses saying you can't come in without a mask, these sorts of things. So that was certainly reflected in a lot of the comments we got in our surveys and our interviews. And I like this first one especially because you read through, you can figure out where they are. Got a lot of grief. I don't know where you're from, meaning the respondent asking the interviewer where you're from, but we had some people come in with fake QR codes, a little shady. A few customers raised their voices. We had to say, what do you think? We want to do this. Having an 18-year-old girl telling you can't be seated, that's not what she wants to be doing. It was a struggle for sure. I don't know if you know the history of Manitoba Southern Health, where they are. One of the lowest percentage of vaccinated Canada. So we got a bunch of hillbillies down here. Bit of a challenge in our region than it was for the city. And so we turn people away, and when they realize we mean it, they said they're never coming back, right? So there was some of that negative as well. Definitely got yelled at a lot. People were upset with the masks, vaccinations, not being able to sit together. So yeah, we definitely got a lot of angry customers and had to deal with a lot of yelling, but we survived. So, you know, they were dealing with that frontline frustration of the public that was really frustrated with the government, but you know how it is in any retail or customer-facing sector, you're dealing with the people angry at you when you're just the business trying to play by the rules and not get fined and not get shut down, right? What else? Staffing was a problem, and kind of because of CERB, right? So a lot of people collected CERB and didn't have to go to work. And it turned out that that really disrupted their ability to get staff. So we had a lot of people saying they stayed on CERB, even though they could go back to work, they decided not to. Once CERB was over, then now they got their 52 insurable weeks, so they stay on EI. So even in the spring, there wasn't a lot of employees applying for work. So we're opened up, restrictions are done, CERB's over, people won't come to work because they can collect EI. So that was a challenge for some of the courses. In terms of supports, one of the, again, things that was expressed a lot was frustration with the government and their lack of support. So infrequent mention of the use of government support programs, frustration with complexity. What I'm getting at there is that, so we asked them, did you take advantage of any of the government programs to help small businesses? And a number of the courses says, well, you know, we looked into it, it was too difficult, it was too complex. We had to do all this hours of work to qualify for some maybe minimal amount of benefit, which didn't even pay, so we just didn't bother. Right? They just didn't even bother applying for some of the benefits that were available because it just wasn't worth it. So there was really very little reliance on government support programs. On the other hand, a lot of courses did say, you know, we got a lot of help from the National Golf Course Owners Association and or from Golf Manitoba. So here's an example of what I'm getting at there. I belong to the National Golf Course Owners Association here in Canada and the US. They would always break down our Manitoba, Saskatchewan protocols from the health authority and say, this is how it affects you in layman's terms. So I read and sort of perused a few pages, and then I'm going, yeah, this is what we need to know. It was a welcome bunch of information to have from the association. The National Golf Course Owners Association was good for that. So this person was referring specifically to signage. They had a bunch of templates. So we'd have to make these signs or print them ourselves, but they provided all the templates ready to go. So it was a really huge help that, you know, so the government says, here's what you have to do. And instead of just fumbling around in the dark, not knowing how to go about starting the process, here's a bunch of templates, just print them. Right? So that was a huge help for these small town, especially small town golf courses. Again, said the same thing already. Volunteer boards, minimally, you know, these aren't, you know, necessarily savvy business people with complex knowledge of regulations and things. It was just, we're just trying to get by, and you're telling us we have to do these things. So the associations were a big help. Okay, what about long-term change? How is this going to affect golf in the long term? So we got through these couple of years. We're kind of back to normal now. If you've been golfing, you know that things are working out just sort of like they were before. But there are some changes that are going to be probably visible and persisting at courses going into the future. So a few things that a number of courses identified. Well, when we went into pandemic mode, the course was open, but we did a lot of things differently. So online sales and cashless transactions. A lot, especially small courses, didn't do this sort of stuff before. And they had to, and they realized this is really convenient. It works really well. The customers seem to like it. We'll probably keep that. Booking tee times. This was a funny one, I thought, being a golfer. There's a couple courses that said this. Actually said, you know, we started asking people to book tee times. I think we're going to keep that. It's like they never booked tee times before. People just showed up and went on the course. They didn't even check in. One of the courses said it was kind of nice that people came in and checked in. So we'll probably keep doing that. Okay. I'm guessing these are the smaller, small town rural courses. And of course, sanitization came up a lot. You know, so we've got all these sanitization stations, the sanitizer at the door or whatever. And you know what? It just makes sense, right? It doesn't matter if we're in the COVID world or not. It makes sense to keep things clean, and people feel better about their health being looked after by the business when we have sanitizing stations. So I think having the sanitizer stations are going to be a thing. They'll be here for another decade, if not forever. It's just good hygiene practice. People are still wanting that. Even though restrictions are lifted, people still feel comfortable. So you make that extra effort, the public's happy. So you just get the idea. Many courses said this. This was one of the few things that they all kind of didn't really hesitate about. It's not like, oh my gosh, this huge burden of having sanitization protocols. We're just going to keep doing it. What else about looking forward? So one of the things that did come up towards the reflection at the end of this period is whether or not this is going to be a sustainable, growth in the sport. It's one thing for lots of people to have gone golfing when they couldn't do the other things they normally do. As I said, we can't go to the gym, we'll go golfing. We can't go on our trip to wherever in the summer, we'll go golfing. Okay, so golf got this great big benefit from that. But now that we can travel again, now that we can go to our gyms and do the other things we used to do, are we going to stick with golf? Or was this just a temporary thing to get us through and then we're going to go back to not golfing anymore? A lot of courses were really concerned about that. So they tried to do a variety of things to kind of encourage people to continue with it. They recognized that this had brought back a lot of people who had maybe golfed in the past and maybe not done it for a while and they were coming back. They recognized that there were a number of new people coming to the sport, parents bringing their kids in, these sorts of things. So we're doing family stuff, family learning to golf, offering more lessons, trying to get new golfers back on the course, back to golfing. So there is this sense that COVID has really revived the industry, of course. Lots of people that weren't golfing took it up. We're going to benefit from this for another maybe 5 years. Then we'll see another decline, I think. So people are kind of speculating that this really was kind of a temporary thing and that trajectory downward that we said preceded the boom may just kick back in. And that's the concern in the long term. So what are some key messages from this study? Well, COVID-19 was mostly good for golf. We have a number of things that will be maintained, many of which probably just, as I said, make sense anyway, like the sanitization. But the most consistent frustration was with the chaotic pace of changing restrictions, and a sense of sort of minimal functional support from the government. The government had put in place all these restrictions and rules and protocols and didn't do much to support these businesses in implementing them. So that was a frustration. And so in terms of lessons learned, maybe we don't have to go through COVID again, but maybe the government should maybe pick up a message that if we're going to be doing things radically different, we need to support the communities and the businesses that don't know what they're doing with this rapid change. So I think those are the really key messages I wanted to get out of this study. As I said, this was supported by a SSHRC Partnership Engage grant, so I acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge we had research assistance from Ian Coey, Master of Rural Development student here at BU. I don't think he's done yet, is he? So he's still around, so I appreciate his help. What's that? Yeah. So, okay, that's my 2 studies on COVID and the impacts on tourism recreation. Happy to take questions.
So this might just be a general comment about survey-based research because it's not my area. So how much of it is like their own perception versus maybe the fact of what's actually going on? And it could be both for the Mexico and for the Gulf. Like, Did you actually ask to see visitor hours or rounds booked or things, or was it was purely their perception of what happened?
Both studies were very, very deliberately perception. So the Mexico stuff was explicitly perception, resident perception surveys. What do you think about life in your community? That sort of thing. And you're right. I don't have data. I didn't ask for data on how many visitors come to these towns in Mexico. How much do they spend? My interest is how does tourism affect people, and how it affects them is how they feel it affects them. So I'm very deliberate on that one. With the golf stuff, I had to be a little more careful in the sense of I didn't want to be asking for confidential information, right? So rather than saying, can you tell me, how much was your revenue in this year? I didn't want to ask that question so as to not discourage participation, because they're not going to want to tell me those sorts of things. So I chose to ask questions more about, compared to a normal year, how much would you say approximately your revenue was up or down? And I used those words in the question. So I was asking them to, from their just thinking about it, ballparking kind of. So you're right. Is this accurate? I have no idea. But does it give you a sense of how these people experienced the pandemic? That's what I was going for.
And then in terms of for the Mexico study, the visitor numbers were still lower in 2022 versus that.
Yeah, for Mexico as a whole, yes.
For Mexico as a whole. But the money spent in Mexico as a whole was, you could maybe even argue, above the line. Is that just because everything was just so much more inexpensive?
So I don't know quite what explains that. I have a couple of ideas I could suggest. You're right. On the one hand, yes, because of inflation, prices being more, fewer people spending on the same number of things would have meant more money. I also suspect, though, that because people hadn't traveled for a couple of years, they kind of came and spent a lot on the next trip. So that might have contributed as well. I didn't look for data on how long people stayed. Did they stay longer than they used to? This is just number of visitors or tourists, I should say, or both. So no, it's a good question. And I don't know, I can't tell you how those two things disentangle, but yeah, it struck me as well. Visitors dropped off and came back up at the same rate. So they hadn't recovered to where they were, but spending clearly did, right? So that was really encouraging. But more importantly, why that matters to me in terms of my interest in the topic is because employment also went back up. So the economy is reaping the benefits, regardless of the fact that there's not as many people as we wanted from the previous trajectory.
Thanks.
I don't know what your interpretation was, but I've found when we've gone down there the last couple of years that hotels and food is more expensive, a good bit more expensive.
Yeah.
All of a sudden after the pandemic, and the flights are a lot more expensive. So maybe the airport are charging higher tarmac fees. I don't know.
I have no idea about that. I think you're right to some extent. I don't know if I would have said a lot more expensive, but yeah, a little more expensive. Now, that's the last time we went was prior to the really big inflation bumps that we've been experiencing here. So I'm going to be really interested to see what prices are like this year in Mexico after this period of 8% inflation and numbers like that. But yeah, you're right. Prices have gone up. So that's definitely part of it. Yeah, go ahead, Wayne.
I was actually in Ireland last summer, and it was the same thing. People were talking about this revenge tourism wave of people, like this just crazy number of people being in Ireland. But they were still struggling with the same thing you're talking about, the golf courses, in terms of hiring people. Like so many of the restaurants were shutting early or like they wouldn't seat the whole restaurant because they didn't have staff. But so just anecdotally on that front. Yeah. For the rural golf course question, research, did you look at it by sort of proximity to the city centers? Because you highlighted the unique situation in Southern Health. Yeah. And I would imagine it wasn't so unique, other sort of more rural or remote parts would have similar challenges around either. And so I was just curious if there was any of that.
So for all the courses I have in my study, I know where they are. And I could go back to the data and see if I can pull out some of those, which ones are close to Winnipeg and further from Winnipeg, and see whether I see tendencies around that division. I haven't done that yet, to be honest. But as far as things like the comment on, the customer reaction and the Southern Health, that kind of thing really only came out in the opportunities I gave them to write, to express, answers, not check boxes or estimate numbers. So I don't know if every course gave an answer to that question, for example, or as much detail. Could I kind of tell from the answers, was there a greater propensity for customer pushback in these kinds of places versus those kinds of places? I'd have to really go look very, very closely at the data to see if I can pull those things apart.
And just as sort of a final comment, I think it's really interesting, like the long-term changes, to sort of get this insight into some of the things that small organizations, small businesses, and small communities are taking away from COVID is really helpful. So for Rural Development Institute, this is really interesting. So thanks so much.
Thanks.
It's interesting because we also did a project on hockey and impacts of COVID on hockey and on the arenas. And some of the same things happened. The arena people said, yeah, we'll probably continue on doing a lot of this sanitation stuff. But like the clients, the parents were like, we have lots of F-bombs and things like that in some of our responses. Yeah, it's somewhat similar. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, maybe not a question. I am from Kenya, and tourism is our main economic earning what? We earn a lot of our income from tourism. Now, during the pandemic, what happened is because we locked our borders, then it increased local tourism. And then we realized what we've been selling to the world, as in we sell Masai Mara, we sell Mombasa, we have what we used to sell was limited. But with the pandemic, we realized counties, because now we have counties, like here you have provinces, back at home we have counties. So we realized in counties we have tourist attractions that have not been tapped, correct. So they started doing sports tourism, where they opened Kasarani, say, gymnasium for the locals to come see what a medal really looks like, or to come see Paul Tergat, the marathoner, in person. We also discovered agricultural tourism, where the farms, mostly flower farms, large potato farms, the Delameres and the like, they open to the general public. So you go, you see what a processing plant looks like. Yes, so it was a good thing that the pandemic came to Kenya.
It's really interesting. I appreciate that. And I would say I didn't highlight it here, but some of that happened in Mexico as well. So a lot of the losses of American and Canadian tourists, not all, but many of those kinds of losses were partly made up for by domestic tourism. So people from other parts of Mexico coming to Puerto Vallarta and places around it. The difference maybe to your example of Kenya would be that, so Puerto Vallarta really is just a resort, right? The city itself, it's just a resort. There's nothing as a tourist attraction, as an alternative to, just the beach and the resorts and the pools and the drink and food and all that. So I don't know that there was really any growth in other kinds of tourism, as you suggested, like agricultural tourism or things like that. But certainly it brought more people to Puerto Vallarta from other parts of Mexico. And I can tell you that also seems to me, maybe Chris could kind of corroborate my observation, in the 15 years that I've been going, even now, I see more Mexican tourists in Puerto Vallarta than I used to. So that might, and we don't capture that in the visitor data because they're not international visitors, right? And that's not international visitor spending. So in other ways, the economy might still be kind of benefiting from that shift that we're not capturing in this kind of data. But it's a very good point, because I think that definitely did happen in Puerto Vallarta. A lot of locals, and maybe there, and I should maybe look at this, a good thing to prompt me to think about. Maybe those might be just as important for the small towns, because to be honest with you, the small towns are working hard to create tourism products and to attract people from Puerto Vallarta on this day trip basis. But it's harder to go to these places as someone who doesn't speak any Spanish than it is for a Mexican who's come from, say, the other part of Guadalajara, Mexico City, or any other part of the country, visiting Puerto Vallarta, to go to these little places where they'll fit right in. I can tell you there's a couple of towns, not the ones in this study, but there's a couple of towns I've been to, beautiful little places. I can hardly talk to anybody, but in Puerto Vallarta, I have no problem getting anything I want anywhere in English because it's a tourist town. So that's one of the capacity questions for these small places, is being able to serve us as foreign tourists. Maybe that's an alternative opportunity for them, is to think more about, can we now benefit from increasing domestic tourism? It's a great example. Thanks.
Very interesting talk. I was just curious to know, how do you think tourism impacts the quality of life of a community? As in the first pie chart, you showed the quality of life was way better with tourism. What are the parameters are taken into account to say that?
So as I said, that's entirely just a resident perception question. We didn't try to give them any prompts as to what would cause life to be better or worse. We just said, how do you feel about life in your community? Is it good? And so that's where I was trying to get at with my second part of that, which is in other studies, so not in this one, but in other studies where we've had these same kinds of questions, most of the time when we get into the details and try to figure out what they are thinking about the economy. They're thinking that this will have an economic impact and that will be positive for their community just in general terms. So will it have a positive impact on the culture of your community? They don't really know how to answer that question. They might think a little bit about environmental benefits. For example, if we are developing something more along the lines of an ecotourism sort of amenity, then there's some kind of protection going on and some sort of development of this as a natural amenity. So that's a good thing. But by and large, the majority of people's thinking about the benefits have to do with jobs and business and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's a wonderful presentation. I want to ask, what role can government, businesses, and individuals play in supporting recovery of tourism and educational centers? That is post-COVID-19 effects. What role can governments and individuals and businesses play in recovery?
That's a really complicated question. So one of the difficulties of answering that question directly is, and so I'm going to think about my Mexico example first, because it really is a big contrast in terms of government versus our experience in Canada. The government in Mexico really tries to be hands-off. This has not just been around COVID. I've seen this happen in other areas where they'll fund investment in infrastructure, or they'll fund something to improve a tourism amenity, but they'll do very little to support people who are displaced or to get people through a period of disruption. So the government in Mexico tends to be, and this is national, but also provincial. There's a little more variation provincially because, or state level, I should say, because the states have a bit like Canada, different parties, if you like, controlling a state level, but the national level for sure has been very much neoliberal, hands-off, let the free market, cope with most of those sorts of things. So what could they do? Well, they could support people who are displaced. There's a lot of ways that could happen, but they choose not to. Contrast Canada, where through the pandemic, the government came out with programs to support people's income, right? So I guess it's finding the right balance. So I would say Mexico is a bad example because lots of people were very, very hurt economically at the household level by the loss of their job or loss of income, and nothing to compensate for that. Hurt a lot of people. Whereas in Canada, as we saw, too much support got people thinking, I don't need to go back to work. I can just keep on collecting whatever I'm collecting. At the same time, businesses in Canada got loans to get through now to pay it back and can't afford to because the repayment terms are so aggressive. So somewhere in the middle there's a right amount, I would hope, of government support to minimize the negative impacts on people and communities without creating undue additional burdens elsewhere or later.
Yeah.
So that's the government end. I know it's not really a solid, specific answer for you, but it's just, I don't think we have it right yet, put it that way. What can businesses do? I'm not quite sure if there's a simple answer to that question either, because businesses at the end of the day are going to do what they can to make money. And so as long as there's an opportunity for their business to be viable, they'll operate. And what can individuals do? Well, I guess one thing that has to happen, regardless of the level of government support, is people have to support each other, for better or worse, right? So this did happen in Mexico for a lot of people. How did you get through? By the support of your family and friends, sharing what they have in terms of, keeping people fed, keeping people housed. Mexico has an advantage over Canada for this sort of thing in the sense that it's a lot easier to live modestly in Mexico than it is to live modestly in Canada, particularly because they don't have a cold winter. And that's just being very blunt and frank about the challenge of living in poverty in this climate, right? Okay. So it's easier in a sense to get by on your social supports in a place like Mexico than it is in a place like Canada. So again, I'm not sure that's a great answer for you, but it's just some ideas about how can we get through these things, which I think is the gist of your question. I'm not sure if I quite captured it for you, but just a few ideas.
Okay, well, let's thank Dr. Eberts again for a very interesting talk.